Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to use the Sentiments for a Yeti and the Santa Elf accessories from Mama Elephant. This is a Mama Elephant heavy card today, and one that I almost started again. So I've cut all the pieces that I need for my Santa and by Elf, which I couldn't find very many samples of online, out of some white cardstock except for the eyes and the mouths. And I'm using some tea-dye Distress Oxide inks. I'm using oxides today for the skin tone, I guess. So this is the elf skin tone, or the elf face. And then these are his ears. And when I was sort of editing this, I thought these kind of look like clogs. So you could make like an elf with like actual feet if you wanted to, if you turn them sideways. But these are his ears. so yeah, don't get too confused. And then there's a piece within Santa as well that is the face part of Santa. So and his nose. So I will get those pieces now. I'm just trying to make sure that I haven't messed anything up, and I make sure I'm in line with what color goes with what piece, because it's all white. You could use pencils for this. You could use your markers, alcohol markers, watercolor markers, depending on the paper, obviously. But yeah, you could use a number of different ways to color your cardstock, or you could just use colored cardstock if you need to, or mix and match. So if you don't have a skin tone, for example, which a lot of the time I don't have that sort of color, then or like a creamy color or something like that, then just make it with some inks and things. So I used some gathered twigs for the hair of the elf, and I just kind of went over it enough that I thought, oh, that's a nice sort of color of brown for his hair. And then I'm going to use some mowed lawn, I believe, for the elf hat. So his, like the main part of his hat. So just getting that on there. That other piece of cardstock is just to keep my fingers out of the ink, because oxides or any distress ink by nature it's very wet, so you'll end up leaving fingerprints and stuff on it. And then I've got candied apple for the red part of the elf hat and the red part of the Santa hat. So very easy, like super simple thing to do if you don't have colored cardstock, or you've run out, or something like that. And then I'm going to go on to the and now I'm going to spritz these pieces with water just to give some texture to them. I didn't do it with like the faces and the ears and things like that, because I just thought they don't need that kind of texture. So, I don't know why, but they just don't. So for me anyway. So I just sort of spritz them. Now I'm going to take some lawn fawn. I've had this for a few years. Textured embossing powder in white. I think it's the only textured one they have, but it's a textured embossing powder, and my husband actually reminded me about that, so without realizing. This is disaster number one. So I have the white, what will be the white pieces of like the Santa hat, so the little brim and the what do you call it, like a pom-pom, I guess. I've got those two pieces that I'm going to attempt to emboss with this textured cardstock. So, embossing powder. So I have my heat tool, and that's fine. So first problem is I nearly burned the paper, and you'll see the burn marks in a minute. So yeah, that starts to burn. I'm like, oh, that's not good. Then I go to pick it up, and I take half the embossing powder off because it hasn't cooled enough. So that's just note to self: make sure that those things are dry before you touch them, because they are essentially like from what I understand, they're like a melted plastic, which is obviously not very good for the environment. But we won't go there now. And so what I did was I grabbed a smaller piece of cardstock. When it had cooled, I then stuck that to a little piece of cardstock that I could use my tweezers to hold away from the burnt paper, and then heat that again. So this is essentially had 2 layers of the texture embossing powder, but it's fine, and it works really well in the end. And then I left well alone until it was dry and cooled. So I did the same thing with the little dot, because again, these are also well, not again, but these are really hard to hold on to. There's different ways that you can do this, but this, for solid pieces of cardstock, this is probably the easiest way to do this. So I then tested a little bit and then took them off there very carefully, and the little like pom-pom thing actually had some raggedy edges, just because of how it was stuck to the cardstock. When I was heat setting it, it obviously had excess powder around it, but it actually works because of what it is. So then the next thing was the background. So this is I think it's 4 3/4 by 6 3/4 piece of cardstock, because this is a 5x7 card that I'm making. And so I have used some Versamark ink and a anti-static powder tool, and I'm using some silver embossing powder. This is a Nouveau silver, I think it's called classic silver or something, and I'm using that for the sentiment. Now in hindsight, I probably should have inked first, because I'm using oxides. They tend to sit on top of things more than like the regular distress inks, or I should have used the regular distress ink when it comes to inking the background here, but you live and you learn, and it still is okay, and it works out fine in the end. And I still love this card. It does look really, really nice, if I do say so myself. So I then have heat set the silver, and I go from behind, because a lot of the times when I use the heat tool from the front, it tends to blow my embossing powder off enough that I am not happy with the result. So when I heat it from behind, obviously you have to be careful of not burning your paper like I did with the copy paper, but I do get a better result if I do it that way around. And then I am adding using a snowflake from that same sentiment stamp set. There happened to be one in there, and I just am using that to dot it around the panel as well. Obviously bearing in mind that I'm going to have these enormous heads sat on there, so I don't need it all over the background. I'm just sort of getting roughly where I think I would be able to see the background, and therefore need an extra snowflake or 2 or 3. So again, I start out at the back of this, and then I thought, well, I'll just see what happens if I do it from the front. It is quicker when you go from the front, I will say, because the heat's going directly onto the embossing powder as opposed to going through a piece of cardstock first. But I still, and for the snowflakes it didn't really matter because they were sort of there enough, but for the detail of the sentiment, I always think it's better to sort of heat it from behind, just get a better result. So this is where it looks really nice and shiny. Then I put my tumble glass oxide over the top, and it goes like really muted and sort of dulls the shininess of the sentiment especially. So I will do my best to like bring that back by buffing it off with the microfiber cloth, but it doesn't totally come back. So this is where either I needed to do the sentiment afterwards, or I needed to use the regular distress ink in tumbled glass instead. Maybe that would have worked better, but anyway, so this is where I'm just trying to buff off, and this is where I realized that it's not as shiny as it was to start with. It's shiny, but it's not as wow as it was to start with, so it's fine, and I keep going with it because I still love it. For some reason there's also like this grey dark area around the sentiment, or sort of in the middle of it, and I don't know what that is. Could just be camera angle or something. I'm not sure. So this is where disaster number 2 comes in. But again, I wanted to leave this in. You guys know I'd rather show you this stuff so you know this is what happens. Just because we edit videos doesn't mean that we don't have these disasters going on. So it starts off all right, and I put his ears on, and I put his hair on, and he's looking really good, and that's fine. And there is actually like a top and bottom to the head shape. So the bottom is sort of the slightly squarer edge than the top edge. This will make more sense later on. So I go and I get his ears and everything on. Now Mama Elephant do this fantastic thing where they give you the instructions on how to put these things together, and I should have read the instructions because I've actually printed that and have it in my like catalogue of stuff that I have, and I should have read it. I should have looked at it I didn't, and his eyes are way too close to each other. The point of these ones, I mean, there's nothing wrong with what he looks like, but he does look wrong when you see what he should look like. The eyes need to be further apart. It's just how they were designed. So of course I took it off, and then it peeled half the ink and paper off, and then of course it left marks where I'd popped them on, further out. So I then tried to fix it with a little it's like a sticky what do you call it, like an erase, takes glue away, can't remember what it's called now, and then put some ink over the top, and then it just looked a mess. So then I really wasn't happy with this, so I decided to take the whole thing apart. So I took the ears off carefully, took the hair off, took the eyes and everything off. Accidentally tore, where I took one of the ears off, it tore the back piece of the card. I'm still going to fix this. So I turned it over. Every piece of cardstock has another side to it, right? So you can see in the slightly there's a whole whack of it that came off when I tore the ear off. So I'm actually going to land up turning the head the other way around. So he's going to be more rounded in his facial features. To be honest, not everybody's face is the same, so I figured it's fine. So I'm sticking his hair back on, and I will trim the head to fit, if that makes sense. It works out fine. He looks kind of cute in the end, and he's just got a more round face, and sometimes not everybody's got a same shaped face, so that would be boring. So you can see the hell that is on the back of that. So I then went back to stick the ears on. I thought I'd use some tape. That didn't work either, so I then used some washi tape just to stick it. You're not going to see it, so it's fine, just to help hold them in place a bit more. And then I sort of have his head back together. At this point, I had already read the instructions about 500 times before I then went back in to put his face on. And to start with, I put his mouth upside down, because that was kind of how I was feeling. I think it's supposed to look like a nose, not a mouth at this point. But that was how I was feeling about this card at this point, because I was thinking this elf it's like that elf on the shelf. He's just so naughty, and it was driving me mad, and I just couldn't get this thing to work. But I wasn't going to start completely from scratch. Worst case, it's a piece of white cardstock. It wouldn't be in the end of the world. I would have just cut another one out and started with a new head, so to speak. But it worked okay in the end, and I quite like that he's got a little round face as opposed to a slightly squarer jawline. He actually turns out kind of cute. Anyway, so then for the hats, I used some washi tape just at the back to hold them together, just to make it easier to add them on when I get to that point. So for Santa, I then very much so read the instructions, because I did not want to do that whole palaver again. And I put his face on, so the white part is supposed to look like his beard and his hair and all that. And of course my camera died, so apologies. But I got his eyes stuck on as well, and then at that point I'd already decided how I needed to angle their faces, or their heads, so that when I put the bobble hats on, or their little hats on, they would actually stick, the little ball pom-pom thing on the end would actually be in the right place and wouldn't cover the sentiment, because of course I hadn't thought that far. So I temporarily stuck the two pieces of the hat together to get the shape of the hat right, and then sort of stuck them on with some more sort of serious tape, and then used some glue dots for the pom-pom bits, and they fit in there just perfect. Yes, I had to cut the ear off a little bit, but I don't mind things like that. I think it actually adds to how the whole thing looks. And then this is a piece of mirror cardstock. I mean, that's years old, isn't it? Mirror cardstock, and it is a bit slippy on there, so it took me a little while to get that to actually stick. and then I stuck it, and it's curled for some reason, which is driving me mad. Cannot get the flat, so I stuck it straight to the card base straight away. So the card base is 5x7, then the silver is about an eighth smaller, and then the main panel where the sentiment is and the heads are is another eighth smaller than that. So I just kind of wanted that silver trim to tie in with the sentiment, being a silver sentiment. But there you go, there's my albeit nearly didn't make the cut card today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope that you learn to read your instructions before you put things like this together. They are really easy to put together. It's just, it was a total user error. Didn't even think about it. So, and he looks much better with his eyes a little further apart. So I hope you've enjoyed this, guys, and I will see you next time. Bye.